Hello and welcome to ACADIA 2021, and thank you for joining us. My name is Biayna Bogosian, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the 2021 ACADIA Conference. I'm an assistant professor of architectural technology and urban environmental sciences at Florida International University, and a PhD candidate in media arts at University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts. We would like to begin by thanking our sponsors and the ACADIA community for making this event possible. We want to also make you aware of a few things before we get started. The session is being recorded and will be available to registered conference attendees. The session is also being streamed live on ACADIA's YouTube channel. In this event, only the presenters are able to participate and broadcast their video and audio. Webinar attendees are able to watch the session and contribute via the chat and Q&A interfaces. We're here now for our second keynote panel, which I'm extremely honored to introduce. When formulating ACADIA's conference theme realignment toward critical computation, we knew that we could not have this conversation around critical computation without highlighting this panel on designing with AI, data, bias, and ethics. As our world has become a live information platform, computational design practices are becoming increasingly dependent on data collection, classification, correlation, visualization, and processing. Additionally, researchers and practitioners are progressively exploring how data, artificial intelligence, and other statistical models might be used in process of design. In the light of this, critical reflection on the social and political implications of data-driven design and data-dependent practices is absolutely necessary. In this context, how do we begin to understand and reveal biases embedded in the data we acquire, collect, or use in the process of design? How are analytical methods similar or different at different scales? What is the relationship between people and power? And in conversations around information access and referring to Shoshana's book, In the Age of Surveillance Capitalism, who knows, who decides, and who decides, who decides? I can't think of four people more appropriate to help us navigate these entangled questions of critical engagement with data, AI, and computational toolmaking on multiple scales. Our first speaker is Benjamin Bratton, whose work spans philosophy, architecture, computer science, and geopolitics. He's a professor of visual arts at University of California in San Diego. He's the program director of the Terraforming at the Strelka Institute. He's also a professor of digital design at the European Graduate School and visiting professor at SciArc and NYU Shanghai. He's the author of several books, including The Revenge of the Real: Politics for a Post-Pandemic World, which was published in 2021. In this book, he argues that COVID-19 pandemic is a crisis of political imagination and capacity in the West, and response, he argues on behalf of the positive biopolitics. His current research project, Theory and Design in the Age of Machine Learning, is on the unexpected and uncomfortable design challenges posed by AI in various fronts, from machine vision to synthetic cognition and sensation, and the macroeconomics of robotics to everyday geoengineering. Our second speaker is Sarah Williams, who's an associate professor of technology and urban planning at MIT. She's also the director of the Civic Data Design Lab. Williams combines her training in computation and design to create communication strategies that expose urban policy issues to broad audiences and create civic change. She calls the process data action, which is also the name of her recent book published by MIT Press. Williams is co-founder and developer of Envelope City, a web-based software product that visualizes and allows users to modify zoning in New York City. Before coming to MIT, Williams was co-director of the Spatial Information Design Lab at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Our third speaker, Lauren Lee McCarthy, is an LA-based artist examining social relationships in the midst of surveillance, automation, and algorithmic living. She's the creator of P5JS, an open-source creative coding platform that prioritizes inclusion and access and part of the Processing Foundation. She's a 2021 United States Artist Fellow, 2020 Sundance New Frontier Fellow, 2020 IBM Fellow, 2019 Creative Capital Grantee, and has been a resident at IBM, Pioneer Work, Autodesk, and Ars Electronica. Her work Someone was awarded the Ars Electronica Golden Mika and the Japan Media Arts Social Impact Award. In her work, Lauren was awarded the IDFA Doc Lab Award for Immersive Nonfiction. Lauren's work has been exhibited internationally, including the Bart Beacon Center, Ars Electronica, SIGGRAPH, and many more. Lauren is an associate professor at the UCLA's Design Media Arts. Our fourth speaker and this panel's respondent is Kathleen Mueller, who's a researcher and educator, works at the creative interface of architecture, structural engineering, and computing. She's currently an associate professor at MIT's Department of Architecture and Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering in the Building Technology program, where she leads the Digital Structures Research Group. Her work focuses on new computational design and digital fabrication methods for innovation, high-performance buildings, and structures that empower a more sustainable and equitable future. Professor Mueller earned a PhD in building technology from MIT, a SM in computation for design and optimization from MIT, and an MS in structural engineering from Stanford University, and a BS in architecture from MIT. She has recently contributed to the organization of several major conferences in architecture and engineering, including the 2017 Design Modeling Symposium, the 2017 ACADIA Conference at MIT, the 2018 IASS Symposium at MIT, which she chaired, and the 2021 AAG Conference in Paris. She's currently developing a new massive open online course entitled Creative Machine Learning for Design, planned to launch in fall 2021. Kathleen Mueller was also the recipient of ACADIA 2021 Innovation Research Award of Excellence. With that, I would like to note that presentation and responses by our guests will be followed by a conversation. I would like to now welcome you all to ACADIA again, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Benjamin Bratton.
So I want to thanks again for the invitation. Great to be on the panel with old friends and new. Lovely to see a lot of my former students from both Strelka and SciArc presenting work at the conference. My remarks for today, based on the invitation, perhaps could be understood as coming from a position of the philosophy of artificial intelligence and trying to provide a little bit of a bigger picture of what we mean when we use this term. What constitutes the artificial, really? And what do we mean by intelligence in terms of the conflation of this? And are there ways in which the things that we identify as machine intelligence might be in some ways misrecognized in terms of what they are doing, what they aren't doing? So one thing to begin with is that it is not clear at this time what artificial intelligence actually is and what it might be. It's clear, I would say, that in some years' time, we might look back on this moment and with some amusement that the term was used to describe so many different things that we all lumped together as this single thing of artificial intelligence. But more importantly, I think, is that it's not at all clear what artificial intelligence is for, what its social, economic, technical, ecological functions might be, and how we make sense of the fact that intelligence in some form has evolved not in an animalian sense, but in one that is inorganic. We should also, as a sort of starting point, sort of be clear that AI is in its present form is used for both very smart and very stupid things, and its ultimate purposes may be largely undiscovered. And for this reason, we should not confuse the present forms of implementation of AI, the things that AI is being used for at present, with what AI actually is. Not to confuse implementation for ontology prematurely, which I think, unfortunately, is part of what the critical discourse may find itself doing in some regards. From the bigger picture, I think we should also understand that natural intelligence, the form that we enjoy, it took billions of years to develop, and obviously accelerated quite a lot in the last 10,000 years, in the last 60,000 years, since the cognitive revolution. And so an evolutionary perspective on machine intelligence, that is, the assemblage of inorganic matter and the coursing of electricity through it in order to produce effects that we might recognize as intelligent, should also take, the philosophy of that phenomenon should also take the longer term evolutionary approach in order to ask some of the fundamental questions about what this is and what it might be for. One of the, I think, ways in which we may find ourselves sort of rotating away from some of the 20th century models around AI is towards what we might think of the post-anthropomorphism era. And what I mean by that is that with the work of Turing, who I think Turing is a saint in many regards, but the Turing test, which is his thought experiment from 1948 and 1950, set up an understanding of artificial intelligence as a form of anthropomorphic mimicry. That is, what Turing set up as a sufficient condition for intelligence, that if a computer could pass as a human, then there must be some kind of intelligence there, as it had instead became a necessary condition. That is, unless the computer can perform thinking the way that we think, then it is not intelligent. And so, this necessary condition, exclusion, became also a basis for an understanding of artificial intelligence as a mirror or mimetic form of human intelligence. That is, if AI is more human-like, it is better. And if it is more human-like, then it is more intelligent. And so the larger, bigger question of that maybe there is a different form of intelligence here becomes excluded at the beginning. And I think we've moved to some extent away from that. And that's a good thing. And we maybe want to explore that. A second point and I want to speak to this bias question and a little bit from perhaps a kind of sideways angle, and do so sort of beginning with this question around data. Models are nothing without data. And we know this, and in many of the courses in AI that one might take, everyone wants to work with models. People are less concerned, less glamorous in some regards to work with the question of the production of data. And I say production deliberately as opposed to extraction. Data is produced in the act of measurement. It doesn't exist in the world pre-formulated before it is measured in some regard. And so the production of data, and obviously you can produce different modes of data about the same phenomenon, is enormously important to all of these kinds of questions that we may want to sort of ask here. Let me go right to the heart of the matter and say around some of the kind of a critique of the critique, so to speak. And some of this comes from the book, the pandemic book. I think the word surveillance has become overexpanded to the point to which it's lost a certain meaning. We can't afford to think of all forms of sensing and data production and modeling as essentially some kind of surveillance in the Foucauldian sense of a pernicious form of social control. And I think the pandemic, if nothing else, made this quite clear. One of the key lessons of the pandemic, I think, is that surveillance cannot possibly describe all the ways that the society needs to be able to sense and make sense of itself. The term, I think, has become blunt and debilitating. The conversation on legitimate and illegitimate forms of data production needs to be understood in relation to, I think, a more expanded notion of what I call the sensing layer of society. So a good definition of the sensing layer refers to all the ways in which a society is able to sense what's going on at a granular and holistic level so as to make a model that it might use to act back upon itself and govern itself. Climate science, for example, produces models of the planet based on atmospheric sensors, surface level sensors, all matters of on-site thermometers and monitors, archives of ice core samples, each of which produces little bits of information that contribute to models that change into this abstracted form of the larger macroscopic picture that we identify as anthropogenic climate change. During the pandemic, however, many societies' sensing layers simply failed. But ultimately, I think we should see testing and inclusive access to testing and sensing as different modes of the same thing. To have more widely available testing is to have more accurate sensing, which means better models, which means a better public health response. To have inadequate planning and provision for testing, to have inadequate sensing, to have inadequate data production, to have inequitable data production means inadequate and inequitable governance. Cities that pass this test are the ones that flatten the curve effectively. Cities that failed the test turned their sports arenas into makeshift morgues. In other words, to be excluded from testing and being sensed, those whose socioeconomic position, urban geographic position, any of the excluded them from testing and being sensed is to not count, is to be a body that does not count. And so the question of the ethics of data cannot only be about a kind of individuated libertarian privacy, it also has to be about the justice of inclusion. The more positive shift, I think, happens in a certain sense about, and that is, it can't simply be about the suppression of individual desire, but rather a larger understanding of the scope and processes of planetary scale computation, more generally. Recently, I had a kind of heated conversation with a Germany-based critical theorist of AI, who argued to me that pervasive, and I think a rather typical position actually, that larger pervasive testing should be avoided because it encourages big data biopolitics, that is, which for him was in fact the greater problem. And he actually encouraged his students not to participate at all in this process, which I think was rather unfortunate. This is in many ways among other things, a recipe of neoliberal social psychology. But it is also one of the ways in which this kind of hyper-individuated libertarian conceptualization of the one's individuality as a primarily sovereign position. It is also the way in which surveillance capitalism is described by critics like Shoshana Zuboff. Surveillance is presented as an illegitimate relationship between a private individual and a coercive collective corporation. What is left uncriticized is the much deeper issue of the organization of planetary scale computation around predicting and placating individual desires in the first place. This is the problem. The organization of planetary scale computation around predicting and modeling and placating individual human desires in the first place is the problem. And unfortunately, it's a logic that is reinforced and legitimated by Zuboff and others' defense of the abused autonomy of the self-sovereign individual subject. So if individual privacy, individual personal data privacy is held as the core essential path for liberation from some tyrannical capture, as well as the linchpin cause around which the political critique of computation should resolve, this will, if successful, only entrench that primary pathology, the grotesquely flattening form of social atomization. That is to say, it is not that the problem is not that the romantic, narcissistic, bourgeois, liberal individualism has been tainted and distorted by bad man with bad machine. The problem is romantic, narcissistic, bourgeois, liberal individualism itself. And much of today's techlash criticism is actually in many ways a kind of creepy love letter to it. Furthermore, we cannot just take back our data from the bad actors and presume that this can necessarily be used for all the right purposes to which a better public data infrastructure might be developed. Why? Because it's the wrong data. The data about predicting individual habits of consumption is just not especially useful for the positive biopolitics, planetary governance, response to anthropogenic climate change that we actually need. We need to producing very different data, not simply taking back this hyper-individuated data in the first place. It also implies, I think, in a bigger picture, pointing towards other kinds of paradigms of what data might mean and what it might imply. One is to think about is the archive. Archive is a kind of form of big data. And to think about climate science as well as a kind of mode of archival interpretation. The archive of the Earth, that is. It's the archive in that sense should be understood as a kind of faithful and inclusive representation of a single deeper moment, sample and prepared for future investigation. And so the ultimate social function of the data representation is unknown because it cannot be known what the future will ask of the present. And per Derrida, as he puts it, the archive is in this sense a promise to the future. that the present will make itself accountable. And in the form of climate science, the archive is also a technology that may ensure that the future itself is even possible in the first place. So 2 quick points to conclude. One is that when asked in isolation, the question of how planetary scale computation might contribute to conceptual shifts and applied interventions in and against climate change, it should be asked understanding that climate change itself as an idea is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation, of the infrastructures that have made this big data model that we represent as anthropogenic climate change even possible to think about in the first place. Last point then, as we think about the long-term emergence of machine intelligence and synthetic intelligence and all of the forms of violence that it is born into, we need to also understand this in the context that any refusal or acceptance of the cost of synthetic intelligence must also consider the price of natural intelligence. It was not only symbiotic social cooperation, but also tumultuous mountains of gore that led our common ancestors from Olduvai Gorge to Göbekli Tepe to the literate cultures of Mesopotamia, East Asia, and Mesoamerica. And so, in a certain extent, the emergence of a planetary sapience, of synthetic human and machine intelligence that we may see at work today, is born into a kind of long-term unpayable debt, that it itself is a product of the violences of its own emergence, and yet, for it to continue to exist, it will have to find a way to overcome this condition, and in a way to imagine, in some sense, a future that would make it worth it in some kind of regard. So with that, I look forward to hearing what the other speakers have to say and joining the conversation later.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to start by thanking the conference organizers for inviting me to join you all today on this panel. I'm very excited to be talking to my fellow panelists. I very much admire their work and look forward to the conversations after. Let me start by sharing my screen. In the last decade, we've created unprecedented amounts of data, which is only set to increase tenfold, largely developed by private companies such as this data set from Google's autonomous vehicles, which creates a new world as cars drive through the urban environment. This new world can be plugged into for almost everything. And while this data set is closed, others are open, available for us to use. And all the excitement from civic hackers and consulting groups such as McKinsey and even Sidewalk Labs left a pain on my side. Did these groups know the ways in which data intentionally or unintentionally can cause harm? Did they know how, in their excitement to do good, they might be marginalizing and even forgetting whole populations? And while criticism began to mount from academics about the potential misuse of data, as you can see in the examples above, and rightfully so, I found we needed a way to show people how data can be used ethically and responsibly. I found we needed to explain to these data enthusiasts and my MIT students alike the ways in which we could use data towards empowerment rather than oppression. So I decided to develop data action, which I believe presents a corrective to standard data practices by acknowledging that data represents the ideologies of those who control its use. The book starts by positioning the reader within the larger narrative by providing historical account of the ways in which those in power have used data to shape our cities, how they have reinforced structural racism, and how data has helped enforce the marginalization of various populations. But at the same time, I illustrate the many benefits that analyzing data has provided society, such as establishing social services and stopping the spread of disease. The juxtaposition of these two outcomes provides us all with a reminder that the person analyzing the data defines how it's used. The book illustrates projects that use data for empowerment rather than oppression. And I take the reader through 7 principles to do that. First, we must interrogate the reasons we want to use data and determine the potential for our work to do more harm than good. Let's take the project I did in Nairobi, Kenya, the maps, the matatus, the small buses that act as the main form of transit. Seen here in the image, these buses represent a large portion of the traffic congestion in Nairobi and were essential for me creating a data model. But I realized that data about this didn't exist for everyone. I thought, how could I create data for my model, but also data that everyone could use and build upon? In this project, our research team collaborated with the University of Nairobi Computer Science Department to develop an application that collected data on the routes and stops. As the data came in, we wanted to visualize the system so everyone could have access to the data for planning. As we developed the map, we asked ourselves whether visualizing the system could cause harm. We teamed up with stakeholders in the community, including bus drivers who helped us edit the maps as seen in this image, and learned that making the systems more visible could help with developing transport in Nairobi. However, you could imagine in other cities in Africa where exposing these systems might cause government crackdowns and therefore removing an essential infrastructure. In fact, several cities asked us to make maps and we refused because of the potential harm developing these maps might cause. Here we see the diverse team that was created for the Nairobi project. Building teams to create narratives around data for action is essential for communicating the results effectively. They allow us to understand the potential harms, but they also allow us to further understand the policy impacts. Here, the visualizations were important for the government, who didn't understand why collecting data was so important until we visualized it on a map. In another project, my research team worked with the Associated Press to collect data on air quality during the Olympics. Through the partnership, we created visualizations that showed data was well above the health standards for developing countries, where no other data was being released by the government at that time. The information was seen by all Associated Press members and started a global debate on air quality conditions in China. That was seen by all Associated Press members, even including the New York Times. 3, we must change power dynamics. Building data helps change the power dynamics inherent in controlling and using data, while also having numerous side benefits, such as teaching data literacy. One way to change power dynamics is by collecting data and presenting it from other perspectives, we saw in the previous example. In a current project in Kibera, one of the most overstudied informal communities in Africa, we created a system where the community built a wireless hotspot that also collects essential information on environmental conditions and a current road development. While this data is often collected by researchers who come outside into the community, they often take this data with them. they don't give it back to the community, and the community doesn't own the information, and they can't use it for their own civic change. Here, you see our partners building the wireless hotspot during COVID, giving them an essential resource as everything moved online, attaching the air quality sensors to these hotspots. The project connected these air quality sensors to part of a global network of sensors. You can see here, Africa is underrepresented in the data, but by contributing, we were literally adding Nairobi to the map, making the issues of air quality available to everyone, but also highlighting the missing data needed for our climate change crisis. The value here is not just in the development of an infrastructure, but the development of social skills. The communities learned how to build this technology and use the data. 4, we must expose hidden systems. Coming up with unique ways to acquire, quantify, and model data can expose messages previously hidden by the public eye. However, we must expose those ideas ethically, going back to the first principle above. In China, we have a phenomenon where whole cities are left vacant. And this is even a phenomenon we see in small pockets of existing cities. The government would say the economics of developing these places are often more important than whether people actually live there. However, I believe these places show the extent of risk in the Chinese real estate market, as has been recently given example by Evergrande development that's been so much highlighted in the news. Our model is based on the idea that thriving cities need amenities, and lack of access to amenities might make a place a ghost development. The model not only set out to identify the risk in the Chinese real estate market, but also shows local planners the ways in which they can improve these places by adding amenities and making them more habitable. Our results on the ground show places like this, which are completely bought, but no one lives. This is because the average Chinese citizen uses properties as a form of investment. This is because previous to the development of the Chinese stock market, there was no way to invest their money, and buying was encouraged by the government. The government needed citizens to buy these homes to drive the economic machine, and started encouraging properties to be highly leveraged with mortgages, or bought with highly leveraged mortgages rather. 5, ground truth. We must validate the work we do with data by literally observing the phenomena on the ground and asking those it affects to interpret our results. In the Ghost Cities project, the data visualizations helped us communicate with urban planners in the area to verify our results. And in turn, they were much more candid with us about the reasons that there were risks in the market. So that previous data visualization I showed you allowed them to understand our model by exposing the components of it through the visualization. Even real estate developers were candid. They talked about how the burst of the real estate bubble will cause irreversible impacts on residents who buy homes with mortgages. And academics talked about how addressing this oversupply is looming ahead. And this is so much so in the recent news that we've seen about this topic. Share it. Sharing data is essential for communicating the need for policy change and generating a debate essential for that work. Data visualizations are effective at doing that. For example, this map showed that $17 million is spent to incarcerate people from just 17 blocks in Brooklyn. The maps were seen on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art, and ultimately a congressman saw them and used the maps to advocate for the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act that allocated $25 million to re-entry programs. While this is just a drop in the bucket, we can see that data visualizations can affect change. Finally, 7, create your own ethical standards. Remember that data are people, and we must do them no harm. We must seek to develop our own ethical standards and call upon others to do the same. Apparently, this is a rule that Facebook didn't follow. And while they asked people inside the company to research these ethical practices, they didn't live by them. I believe it is the responsibility of tech communities and all of us as we build cutting-edge technologies to create ethical standards and think back to the first principle of whether our work can do more harm than good. These principles can help us take data to action, use it to shape our cities for empowerment rather than oppression. And I ask all of you whether you can create your own standards of practice. Thank you very much.
I remember when the feeling of a network connection felt intimate and alive. In 2013, I went on 30 dates with people I met on an online dating site. Using my phone, I streamed my dates to the web and paid crowdsourcing workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk to watch and direct me what to say and do. I had to follow each of the directions immediately. There's a critique in all of my work, but there is also always a part that is about hope, that is earnestly and radically seeking connection. Through this project, I met my partner. I had a dream in which Zoom was a person. He said he considered himself an ally, even if others didn't see him that way. I didn't comment. He was interviewing each of us users, box by box. Mostly we were all about the same, he said. Years ago, I made an app with a collaborator that would analyze your video call conversation and give real-time directions to fit into the conversation, like, be more assertive, or you're talking too much. It was intended as a critique of ever-expanding video surveillance and the use of big data for social control. Now I see this functionality built into consumer apps for next-level productivity, and it's hardly surprising. Like many artists, I've had to question the value of this sort of critique. And yet, here on endless hours of Zoom, I find myself wishing for the prompts of that earlier app, so I can check out completely into auto-reply. Trying to find a sense of identity among all the boxes, I keep changing my virtual background to photos I've taken peering into other people's homes. I have a large collection of these images because I've spent the past couple of years trying to replace Amazon Alexa with myself. People around the world sign up to get Lauren in their homes, and the process begins with an installation of a series of custom devices that includes cameras, microphones, switches, door locks, faucets, and other appliances. For days, I remotely watch over each person, 24 hours a day, controlling all aspects of their home. I attempt to be better than an AI, understanding them as a person and taking action in anticipation of their needs and desires. Sometimes this means following them from room to room, turning on lights ahead of their steps. Other times, their needs are more unique, and I order special deliveries to their home or orchestrate the ambience of a date night. As an Alexa replacement, I speak to the inhabitants with a text-to-speech voice, and they relate to me as an AI.
Where are my car keys? Lauren knows that I like it a little bit cooler than Miriam does.
You know, I'm usually the one that does all these little extra things. So at first I was a little bit careful about asking her, and now it's like, how else can we live?
Lauren has recommended that I get a haircut every 3 weeks, and let me tell you, it's helped with my my self-esteem a lot. I am able to simply approach and carry on conversations with the opposite sex, where at one point or another that wasn't so easy. Lauren, we're out of toothpaste.
Lauren would know what I want, but then maybe it's not what I really want internally. But externally, she thinks that Lauren thinks that playing music or shutting down all my electronics is the best way for me to cope and winding down, when maybe it's not.
Lauren was actually able to help her manage her medication and take her medication on time, and everything actually got a lot better after that.
You have those friends who are kind of about you, like the friendship is about you. That's what Lauren is like. It's like a roommate, it's a friend, but we're always talking about me. It's always about me, whatever it is.
I'm not some automated system. I'm not pre-programmed. And like Alexa and Siri, they don't care about you. But with this, there's nothing artificial. These are people. And with each one, I'm watching and anticipating and trying to figure out what is it that they need. And it almost becomes sort of like a game. Like, sure, I can turn on the lights or run the faucet, but what is the thing that I could do that would bring a smile to their face or actually surprise them or just make them feel something? Watching people in their homes used to fascinate me, but now the thought of doing this voluntarily is unfathomable. I used to like the internet. I spent hours in this grid of homes, my brain unable to piece together so many different people in different places. I haven't felt this simultaneously socially inundated and alone since I hosted a party that went on for 24 hours while an algorithm directed me via earpiece. As new guests cycled in every 5 minutes, the software would tell me what to say, who to introduce to whom, and what to do. I provided the emotional interface for the algorithm, delivering the lines as the human host for its intelligence. Guests arrived one after another, blurring together. Over the 24 hours, the algorithm carried on tirelessly while I slowly broke down. My only distinct memory is the man that arrived and said, "Something you should know is that I have a lot of luggage." After some initial confusion, I realized he meant baggage. For years now, I felt a growing awareness of being tracked. Reduced to a set of data points, I wish for anonymity, yet here trapped behind the Zoom screen, my desire to be seen has never been stronger. I know I'm not alone in this. I offer a small app-based service called Follower, in which I physically follow people, locating them via GPS data that their phones broadcast to me, then keeping them within my sight all day long, physically following them.
So I wake up, I get dressed, I go out, I do things. I read a magazine, and I find out about people. Why do I know about their lives? Somebody should be knowing about mine. I want to share things with people, but I don't want to have to talk to people and tell them what I'm doing. I think it'd be great for them to see what I'm doing. It takes time to build relationships. It takes time to touch base with people. So I don't want another relationship. I just want to have a relationship with somebody that I never have to talk to, that can just follow me and see me having a relationship with myself.
People sign up to download this app and explain their reasons for wanting to be followed. I want to feel less alone. I want to tell a story with no words. I think you'll enjoy me. I have no life other than the one I lead online. I want someone to see me at my best. Nobody reads my blog. Of course, requesting a follower points to the privilege of not feeling subject to constant surveillance already, due to your appearance or identity. I feel so abhorrent. I feel so absorbed. I feel so accepting. I feel so aching. I feel so admiring. When I became exhausted with the constant Zoom calls, I created a digital clone of my voice to replace me. This voice allows me to puppet myself, using it to say all the things I hadn't previously been able to vocalize. I play with the phrases we expect from one another and from machines. You can say, turn off the lights. You can say, wake me up at 7 a.m. You can say, talk to me. I am captivated by the ways we are taught to interact with algorithms and how this shapes the way we interact with each other. What are the rules? What happens when we introduce glitches?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
I feel a sense of power owning the data of my own voice. I'm taking it back from the tech companies, constantly tapping my conversations, sampling and analyzing and archiving my speech for future use yet unknown. Instead, I offer the control of my voice to others. What do you want me to say?
I would do anything for you.
I would do anything for you. What do you want me to say?
I like it when you take control.
I like it when you take control. So that was sort of more from the side of my art practice, but I also wanted to just take a few minutes and talk about another large part of my practice, which is working in open source software tools. And I think this is really feels relevant for me when we're thinking about how to address questions of ethics and bias when we're designing. So if you're not familiar, P5 is an open source JavaScript framework that makes creating visual media with code on the web more accessible. So it has a whole range of purposes. And it's a project that I led for about 8 years and just recently handed off the project lead role. And it's used, in K through 12 to universities worldwide by hobbyists and professionals alike. But what's really important to me is that it's created not just by me, but also with thousands of contributors around the world. And for us, making P5 meant starting with deep uncertainty and many questions, being comfortable with not knowing, with making mistakes, with always being in a process of learning, and following each question until it led us to many more. Oops, sorry. There's some extra slides in here. Questions like, how do you get started with something new when you're scared? How do we ask for help? How do we think about making a tool? Sorry, I don't know where all my slides are out of order. Which users do we prioritize? What assumptions are we making about them? How do we organize our code? Can we value every type and size of contribution? When do we trade performance of our tool for legibility of the source code? How do we elevate the role of documentation? Sorry, I don't know what's happening here. How can we teach people to use the tool? Which language are they speaking? Which words are we choosing to use? How do we make decisions with a large group of people? Can we make space for many different people to lead? How do we acknowledge the endless amount of emotional labor required for projects like this? How do we support one another? We were artists, designers, coders, writers, organizers, teachers, students, beginners. We were contributors, and we could see that our open source project had so many more needs than just code. We needed people to write tutorials and documentation and website text, to answer questions on the forum and respond to issues on GitHub and answer emails, to create curricula and examples and live streams and teach people how to use it, to test and build out web accessibility for disabled users, to work with local communities to organize workshops, meetups, exhibitions, to organize contributor conferences and draft the P5 community statement, to work through conflicts and different opinions. We needed people who could recognize the time this work requires and the need to pause sometimes. Because no tool is neutral, each is built with the beliefs and biases of its creators. We were making a tool for creative expression, so it was especially urgent to have a wide diversity of perspectives contributing to its making, not just its using. And so we were constantly thinking about community and the barriers to entry. How do we welcome someone? How do we keep updating our understanding of access? Who is being cut out by the getting started tutorial that's too confusing, by the tone of communication online, by the use of English language, by lack of a computer or internet connection, by not seeing people that look like them hold roles within these communities, by content that is inaccessible to disabled people, by lack of financial means to volunteer their time. And we felt the uncomfortable contradictions of trying to make this project within a capitalist framework as we dealt with the realities of lack of time and resources. We got things wrong and got hurt and got burnt out. And we reminded ourselves, it's always an option to throw our laptops into the ocean and bow out, but we've chosen not to. Making with P5JS was believing you could make things with other people. We could keep trying, iterating. We were building on decades of trying and learning from teachers in other communities, processing, SFPC, open frameworks, Design by Numbers, Arduino, 3JS, Afrotectopia, PyLadies, Design Justice Network, and many others. And we also wanted this to be a project where you could bow out. As much as we prioritized making it easy to enter the project, we wanted it to be just as easy to exit, to open space for others and open space for yourself to do new things, to be a part of this community even after you've signed off. And so we began rotating the project lead. Could the community provide collective mentorship? Maura took over and then passed it on to Evelyn and Chen. And each of them have brought new questions to P5, stewarding it on a path forward from the 1.0 release that explicitly centers access in every new feature, asking each person that requests a feature to answer the question of how is this expanding access and for whom? And so why am I talking about this? Because I think every one of us can be asking, where do our tools come from? Who makes them? What values are they built with? These are not the afterthoughts or the nice to haves. The values embedded in a tool are directly imbued by the people that make them, and they shape what we do with that tool and by extension, the world we live in. So this is urgent. This begins on the scale of individuals, and this is within our power to change. All right.
Well, thank you so much to all of the presenters. I think you all presented quite different and provocative perspectives on data and its association with artificial intelligence and learning. I'm going to keep my response quite brief because I think we want to hear more from the presenters today. So, excellent. So when I think about data and how it affects our fields, I'm mostly thinking about designs and not people. So I just wanted to add that as another layer of the kinds of data that we can collect. And this is one of my favorite data sets. These are designs for a proposal for a new tower in London that were produced in 1890 in response to the Eiffel Tower. None of them were ever built, but the 68 proposals were all collected and archived in this book, which, in addition to giving the visual representations of the designs on the left, also gives some numerical data, for example, the height, the weight, the amount of material, even the proposed cost. And I think this is, first of all, it's an amazing data set just in terms of the diversity of the proposals, especially for 1890, but also this idea that this public competition would result in data that could be used and reflected on in its aftermath, I think is a compelling model as a way to understand precedents and understand the landscape of designs that have come before us or that might be proposed in a way that makes use of the data science that we have today. I've never done anything with this data set myself, but I encourage you to look at it and see if there's something you can do from it, because it's a rare case in which all of these designs are designed for exactly the same problem. So they have the same boundary conditions, and yet again, we see the diversity of responses. In my work in computational design, I would challenge myself to create a model that could include all of these designs in a parametric model, for example, and I'm sure I would not be able to. More recently, I worked with students to create our own open source data set also based on a competition. This is a competition that GE and grabcad.com put forth in 2013, and this was for mechanical engineers. They asked mechanical engineers to design the best jet engine bracket that they could and to submit their CAD files for this competition. And there are hundreds of submissions, and they're all publicly available. And what we chose to do was to add a layer of information to this data set. And basically, we simulated all of the designs that were produced in the competition and to understand their structural performance, their weight, their stiffness, but also to start to categorize them in terms of their design concepts and see if we could kind of extract meaning from this process. And we've started to do that. We haven't been able to build a machine learning model that can operate on all of this data yet. But in the meantime, we've created this open source set here that anybody can access and cite and work on. And we presented this at a conference in computer graphics at the Geometry Processing Symposium earlier this summer. And we think this is an interesting way for us to start to have kind kind of a baseline that we can all work on together in order to advance an understanding of design and data. So I think, Benjamin's comments about archives and libraries as a kind of early data set is something I think is really important. We don't have a lot of data sets, so I mean, there are a few others that exist, but we actually have very, very little data in architecture and design, which I think is interesting. We have a lot of data from consumer behavior, of course. Well, we don't have it. Someone has a lot of data about consumer behavior. Sarah can do amazing work extracting data from urban environments. Lauren is doing really interesting work trying to kind of operate between humans and machines in terms of interacting with individual behavior data. But in general, compared to these kind of large public-facing domains, in architecture and design and art, we have almost no data. So I think that's another interesting thing to reflect on. And personally, I would love to see more of it. I would love to see more data that is publicly accessible, that we can agree on in terms of what metrics we're studying and what they mean, that are part of an open debate, and that we can work through together. So that's my small contribution to this question. And with that, I'd like to move to the conversation part of this event. I don't know, do Lauren or Benjamin or Sarah, do you want to add anything first, just before we get started? Excellent. Well, maybe I'll start by getting a little bit into the question that I thought Lauren brought up in a really interesting way. One of the people you were working with in one of your videos, the question about sort of human intent and data. So I think one of the speakers in your video asked or remarked that Lauren, the new Alexa, through external observation, you thought she knew what the person wanted and needed, but in fact, you didn't. And I think that's a very interesting question about data. That it's a blunt measurement of things that we care about, right? Can you guys remark more on that? How do you choose what to measure? What should we measure, and what do we really care about? And what's that relationship? How do we calibrate that relationship? And maybe Sarah, you're the one most actively taking measurements. So how do you decide?
Yeah.
How do you decide?
I mean, maybe I'll start. I mean, I think, I have a reflection on what you said, and then I'll talk about dating. I think one of the things that I've been working on my lab recently is like something called the Missing Data Project, which is like trying to uncover data that doesn't exist, and by doing that, elevating the stories of those on the margins. And we spent some time doing that during COVID, right? Like the fact that, I mean, this is now very well known that we weren't creating race data, made it very hard to make decisions. But I think there's a lot of data in the urban environment, which is purposely not collected, that needs to be collected in order to elevate stories. So I guess, but I think this is a more broader question, because what is our intent in collecting that data is a really important thing to think about when we do data collection, because I think sometimes when we bring our own biases to data collection, we expose, or let's say unintentionally, can cause harm. So I think your question was a bit loaded, because like on the one hand, I collect so much data because I want to elevate positions on one side, but then at the other times there's data that can be collected that can cause potential harm. But I was also thinking about your reflection of data and architecture, and I have a good friend who's been going around collecting building architectural plans from different offices, trying to collect that data. And what's interesting, I think, right, is like she's trying to use it to understand value in real estate development, but we do have tons of data in architecture, right? But it's just closed off. And right, like if you think about, if you could all get a model of all of the architectural plans for like recent super talls in New York City, and like you could do a comparison of them. And I'm not sure how we open the data sets up, right? Because they involve so much privacy, but I think it would be really interesting to try to do. And I'm just thinking about my friend Andrea's, who's doing that. Like she's been able to create a lot of value through that data creation and collection. So it gets back to this collection issues that I think when we attempt to get the missing data, we could actually do a lot of positive benefits.
Yeah, great. Lauren or Benjamin, do you have anything to add? Oh, Benjamin, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I appreciate what Sarah was saying about this question of the collection and curation of the data, and Caitlin, your point about the kind of thinking about the archive and the longer term aspect of this, right? Like many of the, I think the most, geological sciences, climate sciences, many of them, like the really interesting epistemological shifts that big data has brought in one way or another, are very long-term samples. And I think part of the culture of big data at this moment is about a kind of instantaneousness. And I think that's also kind of part of the problem. I wanted to address directly your question about measurement, though. One of the things that this in certain sense comes down to is, the act of measurement is an act in many cases of quantification, but it's predicated on a kind of linguistic categorization of the phenomenon that would be identified and made discrete in the first place. Like that, this is one kind of thing, that is another kind of thing. And this categorical logic is not quantitative, it's qualitative. It's linguistic. It's symbolic. And so I realized that to a certain extent, some of the political controversies over data and quantification in the academy is to a certain extent a little bit of a war between the arts and humanities and the science on one side and the science and engineering on the other. And we sort of blame math for these problems. And if we could just embrace, affect and language and meaning, once again, this would solve the problem. But in fact, behind the math, the measurement is about a linguistic kind of structure. And so this conception goes on sort of both sides. One of the key points, though, and I think, I really love Lauren's work about the way in which the kind of the anthropomorphic constructions around AI, and I think some of the strangeness of that momentum, strangeness of that kind of the impetus with sort of work that I think is extremely important. In many cases, though, I think one of the things that is also important, again, and I try to make this point, is that in many cases, some of the most socially important, politically important uses of data production and modeling do not involve the modeling of people whatsoever. And I think we all kind of made this point. And like part of the limitation, I think, of both the Facebook model, of the Facebook view of the world, that the world is constructed of atomized individuals with predictable desires, but also the problem with the critique of the Facebook model, which is if we could just if these individuals could counter-weaponize and make themselves yet more private, then that would solve this question. I really would like to point the attention away that many of the most important issues will involve the modeling of carbon flows, the modeling of electricity flows, the modeling of land use flows, that don't necessarily involve a representation of humans at all, let alone a fair or unbiased one in one way or another. And so there's a certain sense, I think, that we're at a point where we can open up this conversation in ways that might be more allows another set of directions to become clear.
They do include people. Like we're the one using the carbon, right? Like at the bottom line, right? Like if we're going to change behavior of environmental behavior, like who is creating that carbon is a human, right? Being.
No, it's humans, but it's not. I want Lauren a chance to jump in here. It's humans, but I would. Just in general, I would strongly push back on the idea that if we can model individual consumer behavior and quantify individual carbon footprints, that somehow that's going to add up to infrastructural decarbonization. Like, no, the issue has to do with, carbon taxes and other kinds of like infrastructural scale implementation policies, not just about pushing this problem to the end user and saying, well, it's just a moral question. And if you just be a better person,
right,
this will all cascade. Like, if you see what
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Lauren, would you like to add anything?
Sure. As the sort of non-theorist in this group here, I think there are people at every scale of this. And when we're talking about modeling and talking about data, there, I guess I just like to remember that there are also people making those decisions about how those models are made and what they're used for and what data is incorporated into them. So I guess I'm just always thinking about, our tendency to see something as a technical problem when I believe that there are people involved in every stage of it. And also just when we're talking, Benjamin, you made this distinction or maybe lack of distinction between like a quantified data and something that's more linguistic or soft or effective. But I would also want to blur the or maybe open up the line around like the collection of data in general. I think that is in itself a specific kind of instrument of knowledge, the idea that we're going to collect data and information and then model something, whether that's affective data or qualitative or quantitative. And I think there's a lot of other ways of knowing and understanding. And I don't know that those are often incorporated into some of the technical models that we build. So I think that's like something that I've always been really focused on in my work. It's just like how, for the person that does not understand or feels like this is kind of like out of their domain of expertise to be thinking about like large scale modeling, how do we recognize that actually those people are essential to the conversation as well?
Yeah, there's a lot in your point. And I think we probably agree in many regards. To sort of clarify what I was suggesting here was not that, to suggest that behind the quantification is a qualification, like behind the math is the language. It doesn't suggest, that's a way of, in fact, reinserting, I think, human, sort of there's human phenomenological perception of the world back into this question. But it's also a way, I think, to sort of insert back to this question of abstraction. Like, I think one of the things that ties both of these together are dynamics of abstraction. There are modes of quantitative abstraction that allow us to take all these climate data points and find a hockey stick. There are modes of qualitative abstraction where we can compare and different kinds of experiences and different kinds of relations between this in different sorts of ways as well. So I think to a certain extent, I'm not suggesting that I would be the last person to sort of suggest that we just sort of give up on the linguistic and just embrace the math and be done with it. That's not at all what I'm suggesting in any kind of regard. I guess to a certain extent, I think one of the things that ties those work together in a certain sense is an interest in understanding the politics of abstraction. The politics of abstraction and how that can work through the abstraction of ideas into tools, the ideas of tools into outcomes, the relationship between the linguistic and the quantitative as different modes of abstraction that depend upon each other. But what we're building ultimately is hopefully are certain kinds of collective intelligences that go beyond any one of our individual perceptions. It might get built up from lots and lots of human actions, but we're building a collective form of abstraction, and I think the collectivity of that is actually what makes it potentially politically powerful in ways that we shouldn't overlook.
Yeah, that's really, really well said, Benjamin, and super interesting perspective. Sarah, to your point about floor plans, I'm always just super interested in this because I always hear, nobody wants to give this data up. No one who's currently practicing and who owns the intellectual property of their designs wants to give them to anyone, probably for the same reasons that people don't want to give their data to Google or Facebook. But also, not only because they don't want someone else to exploit them, but because it's their means of operating. On the other hand, the owners of the buildings actually also own the floor plan to some degree. So there's a lot of privacy there that I guess we could debate whether that's good or bad. What about public building, publicly funded work? How do you see that? Do you see if the government is building buildings or infrastructure, does the public deserve access to that data in terms of the design or to the
That's a good question. Maybe we can go back to the 7 principles. And I would guess my first question would be, who could be potentially harmed by the release of that data? I mean, beyond whether it's like public information or not. And I guess, you know, there are some public buildings that are quite sensitive, right? So there could be a potential harm, but I guess.
For example, embassies, which the GSA is in charge of producing, but obviously embassies are highly, have a lot of security associated with them. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe like, I mean, it's a question like, what a public, like, could you open data about a public school, or like what other public, I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, because there could be a lot of value in analyzing school data to understand learning and maybe, let's say, quality, like, you know, quality learning environment. So it seems like, you know, there potentially isn't a harm in doing that, but we'd have to. So I would say my answer would be yes, as long as it's not harming anybody. I don't think, I mean, in terms of that, let's say like a current one, right? Like an architect, like would they be giving out their secret sauce by giving out their floor plan of a public building? And I mean, I think that I'm not sure if there's a potential harm for an architect in that, let's say that the building you find it to be very good, you know, like I think there is potential value in its analysis, potentially. And that going back to that, my friend who's doing that, that's why people are actually sharing the data with her, because she's using it to see how different plans add value to the real estate development process. So how to different, I mean, this is like very outside of an architecture framework, but it's like very real estate framework, but like do certain kinds of designs then create like more rent basically, or but then I think architects might not like that, because, you know, like certain architects, like the developer architects would like that because, you know, they can, but then architects might, you know, their design isn't valued or could be undervalued, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I would just sort of echo that a little bit. I think the interesting question about the public ownership or public use of the data opens the question of kind of what do we mean by which public are we talking about? What do we mean by public in this way? And some of the examples that Sarah was talking about, what I'm hearing, and I think it also is an important question, is there's an implication that there is some form of public governance, let's say, that is able to actually make use of this information in some way and act upon it. That it's not just information about the world, but that the model becomes recursive. It actually is a mechanism for acting back upon the world through the implications of the model, not just knowing more for its own sake. And so I think part of the question should be asked at this point is if we do see a kind of shift in the role of models and abstraction that are quantitative and qualitative as part of how cities recursively compose themselves and govern themselves and remake themselves, and the buildings and the people and the processes and the services that go in here. Who does this? In what sense does this imply not just technical practices, as Lauren suggested, but also a shift in the logic of socio-political governance per se, of what a government does and what governance means more generally, and what are the institutional changes that would need to happen in order for that to even be conceivable and possible. We'll put a plug in for a good friend of mine, Ben Cerveny, runs a thing called Foundation for Public Code in Europe, where it's a federation of different CTOs of different European, Helsinki, Barcelona, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and others. And they help cities build open source platforms for the provision of public services, and then they containerize and allow help other cities use these as well. But one of the things that you're seeing a lot is that this ability to sort of produce the public government producing public models for public use is increasingly not just something that governments do, it's what governments are. And I'm not sure that I think that's that's something that's very difficult to explain to political scientists. But I think to a certain extent it's becoming increasingly part of this question of like what the public role of data should be.
It's super interesting.
You know what I was thinking about in your question, and I should let Lauren, but it's like, in a way, public school, like floors or plates are already available. It's just not easy accessible. So like, that's the other thing, right? Like somebody needs to digitize it all. And then once it does become easy accessible, is that what like potential benefits to have? And I think there could be a lot, but anyways, and then what systems do we create to make that happen is the next stuff, which goes back to policies. Like, so if you build a public building, do you check in your floor plans and then use it for that kind of benefit? I think it's interesting.
I mean, I think Vernell has a really interesting question about do we lack imagination in terms of understanding the potential downsides?
Yeah.
And I think it's a super interesting question. I always, when I studied engineering, it's all about failure modes. You basically spend the whole time thinking, what can go wrong? What are all the things that could go wrong here? In architecture, it's the opposite. Like, what can we do? What amazing things are we going to do here? And I think this problem, Vernell's point, definitely demands a sort of more engineering mindset that is doesn't necessarily come naturally to when you're thinking from a design
I really
perspective,
enjoyed your talk,
or maybe even from a kind of data, being excited about data perspective.
I have your book, Sarah. I on my shelf.
Oh, cool. It's always nice to hear when you don't know. When you release a book in a pandemic, you have no idea what's happening. Is it out there? I don't even see it in a bookstore.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Benjamin, Sarah, Lauren, and Caitlin, for highlighting some of the technical, sociospatial, political, and ecological questions and concerns regarding data access and power. We're really, really grateful for your time and for your contribution. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It was great.
To see you all.
Great to see